Hi, and welcome back to the Fierce Kitten Studio channel. So, a lot of you guys have been asking me for help on how I make patterns. I don't really use Illustrator. I do things in a very unconventional manual way, but hopefully, what I do and what I go through in this tutorial video will be able to help you guys come up with your own patterns and go from paper to fruition. So, let's get started. So a lot of people, when they make their patterns, they initially come up with a sketch, an idea of what the final bag is going to look like. I did this with both the Mighty Messenger and with the Convention Raider. The switch case was a little different. I actually just used that for myself and for commissions for the longest time. And then I was like, well, I probably should digitize it since the Switch was released and it was a year later. And people wanted it. So with that one, I don't even remember what I did, but I know that with the Mighty Messenger in mind, I went ahead and I kind of sketched out the idea for what I wanted for the bag and roughly, what I wanted for the dimensions. It's very important is to understand the sizing of the bag. Once you understand the sizing and then work through construction, like in your head or doodling it out, it makes things a lot easier on you. So I started with a picture and then I took that picture and I broke it into the various parts that I wanted to have for the bag. So the pattern pieces in particular. I definitely try to keep things on the lower end in terms of pattern pieces and leave the pattern in such a way that it's open ended enough that somebody with more advanced skills can then go in and say, well, I'm going to add a pocket here. Or I'm going to remove this pocket on the front because I just don't like it. You see that a lot, and the Mighty Messenger in particular is very customizable in that way, and I love seeing everybody's creations. Um, the other thing I also try to consider is people who want a fussy cut, or people who would like to use embroidery or embellishments on their bags. The Mighty Messenger is huge for that. Not so much in the Convention Raider, the flap on that is a little small, but you can still add a lot of bling to it if you need to. So once I have an idea in my head of how everything should look, I actually start tracing out pattern pieces and notes onto this tracing paper. So technically, it's not really paper. You can find it in the interfacing section. It's a pattern paper that's actually made by Pellin, and it has 1 inch markings on it. I never really trust the 1 inch markings, though. I always go off of my own rulers, but so this is basically the flap, the first flap that I did for the Mighty Messenger, and as you can tell, it's huge. But, I made notes on it as to how I wanted everything done, on it and measured out, where the magnet should go, and, like, trying to figure out where the zipper pocket hole should be was the literal worst. That and the height of the flap pocket. Um, well, the flap itself, I mean. So I trace everything out onto this paper and then I start working on testers. And I get things kind of finalized to a point where I feel comfortable with it. And then I worry about digitizing and taking feedback from my testing group. So, speaking of testing groups, please make sure that you have no less than 10 people testing. Everybody does things in a different way. It's very important to have your patterns tested not only for accuracy, but also understandability. Right? Is it legible? Does anybody understand what the heck you're trying to tell them to do? Are the images that you provide clear and legible? Because I can't tell you how many times I've opened up a pattern that I've downloaded and there's no illustrations, there's no pictures, or maybe there's one picture to a wall of text, and you're like, "Great, thanks." Um, and the worst is when you get pictures that are fuzzy or the lining fabric and the exterior fabric are too close together. If they're so similar that you can't tell them apart, that's gonna really suck for people who are colorblind. Um, so that's why I kind of adopted the approach of using illustrations instead. So for anybody who has downloaded one of my patterns, you'll know that I use illustrations to actually show off everything, and try to more clearly provide that instruction. The other thing that's really popular is to give people a video. I'm getting a little off track. So, anywho, tracing paper. All right. Once I get the paper pattern, or rather the traced pattern, kind of figured out, isolated, woo, I don't know what I'm doing anymore. I've got all my notes on this. I feel confident that I can start digitizing this and getting it into the hands of my testers. What I do is I scan them. So I have a printer slash scanner, and I put these pieces onto the scanning plate and I start scanning them in. Now, one of the things that you'll note is this is huge. And a lot of times this is too big for scanning plates. So I actually scan it multiple times. So I scan this portion and then I scan the bottom portion. And then I use a program called Photoshop to kind of overlay them on top of each other so that I can make the whole pattern. It's not ideal, but it works. And like I said, this is a little unconventional because a lot of people will go into Illustrator. I hate Illustrator. I can't explain to you the amount of hate that I have for that application. So I don't use it unless I absolutely have to. And nobody's held a gun to my head yet. So yay. So I use Photoshop. Um, and I have found that it's just as good, and I can make cleaner lines. And I've actually been told by pattern companies who make, who make the acrylic templates for me, that they are a lot easier for them to digitize, because the lines are thicker, and provide a little more for them to kind of grab onto and to start digitizing in their software what they need to do in order to make the laser files, whatever those are, Glowforge files. Um, so I bring everything into Photoshop. So once I've scanned it, and I'm gonna pop over to my desktop. Don't mind my little tiki guy. We'll move OBS off to the side here. This is the actual um, Photoshop file, PSD file. I don't know if I even, yeah, I have the original scan in here. Let me see if I can open that. This is the craziest thing. So here's the original scan that I put in here. And you know for a fact that like you, unless it's unless you need to or have a piece that is big enough to fit on the paper, you're gonna have to have it such that it's cut on the fold. It's just gonna happen. So unfortunately, so you can see this is why I put the dotted lines in here. Let me zoom in. It might be a little easier for you to see. But these dotted lines from the original scan are actually the center. And then I had like the flap fold guide for the fussy cutting. So people would know like, okay, this is going to be the top part that's folded over. So if you fussy cut something, then it's kind of okay for this to be the crap part of your fabric. I do provide the 1-inch printing guide, if anything, that just lets people know, oh, whoops, I printed at the wrong scale. Or I printed at the scale that I wanted, because sometimes people want to shrink these or make them larger, which is another reason you'd want to make this on the fold. And I actually just draw these in as boxes. And I mean this one, of course, was a lot easier to do, because the Mighty Messenger basically is a bunch of rectangular pieces. And then people would be like, why did you make it so we had to print it? And I would say, well, because it's easier for you. And I hate measuring cut patterns. I truly do. But you can see here, right in this section, where it kind of looks a little offset. That's where the first scan and the second scan ended up being overlapped. Let me just get down in here for you so you can see. And basically, all I did is I make markers throughout the pattern piece so that I know about where things got cut off, and I overlap things. So I can tell when I'm overlapping, basically by changing the opacity of one of the layers. And so I set this layer to be like maybe 50%, and then dragged it around to match up. And actually, I will show you that. We'll go File, New, and I'll create a new one here. So let's say I create, we'll create a box here. So all I do, let's say if this is a pattern piece, I fill that in. Actually, hold on, not in the background. Create a new layer, and ta-da, that's my pattern. And I fill that in right there, control A and then alt backspace to fill in. And I fill it in, and then I just go up to the selection and modify, and I contract it, about by 5 pixels. I usually contract by 5. And that'll take the selection and make it smaller. You can see all the little dancing ants around it. And then I delete. There's your box. And that's basically it. As far as measurements go, you can actually come in here and measure and know what this will be. So when I scan and when I do these kinds of patterns, see, we'll go up to image size. You want the resolution at 200. If you need to, before you start going through all the work of tracing things, go ahead and do this guide and then print it out and make sure that you're working in the right resolution. I do 200. And I apologize, this is not meant to be a Photoshop tutorial, so I'm not going to go over a lot of detail in this, but let's say, I have this other one and I wanted to line them up. I want to line these guys up. So let's see, we're going to simulate this. So this is the top scan and this would be the bottom scan. So with this one, yeah, I can kind of like do this, but sometimes they're crooked, how the scanners are. So I change the opacity to 50%, and then I can go in and kind of overlap them and figure out where that overlap happens. And it kind of helps to line things up. Now, in this case, this is like the literal worst example because Photoshop's just snapping these two things together. You're not going to get that with a scan because all of this is going to be filled in. But that's how you change the opacity. And just set it down so that it's enough that you can see when you're hovering over the other piece. So that's how I did that. But in general, that's really all I do is I come in here and I make these parts, and you can tell already it's like, well, um, I cut off the portion where I felt like I was going to definitely need another uh page in the PDF file. The flap is both very wide and very tall. And so I had to create, here's the top, and then I had to basically, once I got the one big piece put together in another Photoshop file, I cut it in half and brought that in here. And then over here, you can see here's the bottom, and there's the original scan where I had cut it off. So basically piece them together as the originals and then just cut them into manageable pieces and bring them in. Now, for the curves, I actually do use a path here, which I know the irony, right? Because I hate Illustrator. But yeah, I use paths to get the curves. So once I'm done with creating these files, let's see, we close that out. Then I just export them and put them in a PDF file. And that I actually use Illustrator for that. But I just create a PDF file and I send it out for testing. So let's see back over here. Yeah. So it's back onto the testing thing. Usually, I mean, it really depends on the pattern. It took us about a month for my group of testers to nail down the Mighty Messenger. That is largely because of the gusset and the flap. The gusset was really hard to nail down the size, like the correct length for it once it was put together. The industrial machine, quarter inch, half inch measurements are kind of iffy. As in, some stitch plates aren't as accurate as others. So some of the feedback I got initially was way off because people were connecting the gussets at the wrong, stitch width, seam allowance, English. So, because I use a half-inch seam allowance with all of my patterns, it seems wasteful, but it gives people room to wiggle especially if you are using foam, like with this pattern. Um, I didn't want to be too floppy. And that's the other thing is like when you're going through and creating patterns, you have to think like, well, what's the shape of the bag and how do I want to maintain that shape versus the size? Because as much as I would love to tell people you don't need to get flex foam, unfortunately you do if you don't want this thing to fall apart on you. And the other thing is the bag was meant to be able to carry an iPad Pro, like the 12.9-inch big one, which is what I have, and I love it. But it, it wouldn't stand up if I didn't give it some kind of padding. So it's kind of got a mixture of a lot of different interfacings, but that's largely because it was meant to hold tech. And again, that's something people can admit. Don't worry about it. I built it in because that was one of those things I didn't think everybody would be able to understand how to build it themselves. And so I included it as part of the pattern. But it's not required, and an advanced seamster will be able to go in and remove the, extraneous stuff that they don't want to do with the pattern. So don't worry about that too much. If you get into designing patterns. Um, Though one point to make, let me pop back to, you see, this is how I am when I stream too. I'm incoherent. Um, Letters. You need to let people know where things connect. The first time I released this to my testers, I forgot the letters and no one knew how any of the stuff went together. So that was the literal worst moment. But we nailed everything down. We got things into a good spot, and I feel like, um, with all the testing and the things that we did, this was still a really good pattern, and I'm very proud of it. Now, the convention raider, that one was a little different. That actually came together really well. It did look like a sanitary napkin on my first attempt, but once I nailed it down, we really had like a good flow for um God, that's a terrible roll in, but whatever, I'll let it sit. we but I actually had that one done pretty fast. That one, I don't think I even have the original trace for that anymore. Yeah, I don't. I just have the final printout, but the convention raider is based off of all these bags I kept seeing around people's hips and wrapped around their thighs at conventions, hence the convention raider. And I loved it. And I was like, my God, that's an awesome looking bag. Not so good if you're wearing a dress, but you don't really have to wear it around your waist. You can crossbody it if you want to, but yeah, that one went through testing, and I actually had people who have never sewn before make that pattern, and I knew that was great. So, like, I guess another unsolicited advice tip, get people from all varying degrees of experience to test your pattern. The reason the convention rater is so concise and easy to follow is because I had the two new sewists in the testing group who were like, I don't know what you mean by this, and what did you mean by that? Because sometimes when you get to the point where you've ascended to a higher plane of existence and you're making bag patterns for sale, um, you forget some of the things that people don't inherently understand about making bags. Like, assuming people know how to put in magnetic closures, or assuming people know to double stitch the straps so they don't get pulled by, users and ripped completely out. Um, so, I mean, yeah, that's basically it. So I trace, well, I design on paper. I kind of figure out everything that I want to do with the pattern, and how I want it to look and the basic breakdown of each of the pieces. And then I start tracing it out on the pattern tracing paper, um, and scan it in. And then I trace it digitally using Photoshop, and usually just straight lines, just the line tool. Um, Text for flavor because it's good for people to know which piece you're working with. But um, I mean, and then I just assemble it all into an Illustrator file. Now, as far as instructions go, I just use Google Docs. And I also use, you don't have to, but I use Photoshop and I make illustrated, um, images for mine. That's, I mean, that's basically it. I know I kind of brushed over all of this. So I figured like what I can do is this will be like an overview, and then I can drill down as people ask more questions in the comments and make more videos to kind of expand on this and maybe like, okay, here's a Photoshop lesson on how I trace a pattern piece. And go through that. Or here's my thought process in designing a pattern and I walk you through designing. So that might be useful as well. So please feel free to leave a comment below, like, subscribe, all that stuff people force you to do on YouTube. But don't worry, I won't force you to use Illustrator until you need to export to a PDF file because I love you. Um, so as always, I stream on Twitch on Mondays, Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays, starting at 9 p.m. Eastern ish. So thank you so much. Bye.